talking to him, just let us know beforehand. And this is the first time that the trust has been breached to this magnitude. Have a seat. Let's have a little talk time.
So,
a wedding. The one day where joy is supposed to overpower fear. The one day where family comes together, lays down their grudges, and witnesses a sacred vow between two people stepping into forever. But not in the Plath family. Not under Kim Plath's shadow. Not in the twisted world of Welcome to Plathville, where even a wedding day can be weaponized, turned into a battlefield, and stripped of its peace. Hello everyone, this is Sophie, and you're watching Sister Wives Chapter and Reality Scandals Daily. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell, and leave me your thoughts in the comments below. Because what we're about to unravel isn't just another TV moment, it's a family imploding in real time, with faith, power, and loyalty being used as bargaining chips, and Lydia, of all people, is trapped in the middle. Now let's set the stage. This was supposed to be Lydia's big day. After years of walking the careful, suffocating line between family obedience and her own independence, Lydia finally had a moment that was hers. She was marrying Zach, a man she chose, not one selected or filtered through Kim's iron grip. A wedding is supposed to be sacred, right? It's supposed to symbolize leaving one family unit and starting another. But if you've followed the Plaths long enough, you already know, nothing escapes Kim's control, not even a ceremony designed to unite hearts. So picture this. The flowers are set, the guests are waiting, the cameras are rolling. The Plath family, fractured as ever, files into the scene. Some of them, like Micah and Mariah, carry the scars of years of battles against control. Others, like Ethan, arrive with a storm already brewing inside. And in the middle of it all stands Lydia, a bride who should have been glowing with freedom, but instead looks like a soldier walking into a war zone. Because behind that smile, behind that lace dress, behind the carefully chosen hymns and vows, sat a family whose fractures were too deep to mask. And if you were watching closely, you could feel it. This wasn't just a wedding. This was an ambush. What was at stake here wasn't just Lydia's happiness. This wedding was symbolic. It was the final test of whether Kim could still hold her daughter in the same grip she once had on all her children. Would Lydia bend? Would she let her mother dictate the terms of her joy, or would she dare to break free, even if it meant angering the very woman who raised her? That's what made this day so critical. Because unlike her siblings, Lydia has always been portrayed as the obedient one, the peacemaker, the girl who prayed, who submitted, who carried the torch of Kim and Barry's vision long after the others fled. For years, viewers saw her as the perfect Plath daughter, the one who wouldn't rebel, who wouldn't stray, who wouldn't embarrass the family name. And so when the cameras zoomed in on her wedding day, the tension was unbearable. Would this be the day Lydia finally showed who she really was? Or would she fall right back into the cycle of silence and submission? Now let's talk about the emotional tone of this wedding. If you listened to the conversations, if you read between the lines, you saw it. Faith wasn't being celebrated that day, it was being weaponized. This wasn't about prayers of blessing. It was about ultimatums disguised as holy counsel. Kim had already laid the groundwork, whispering into Lydia's ears with warnings and conditions, framing loyalty to her as loyalty to God. Think about that, a mother twisting her child's faith into a leash on her wedding day. If that doesn't make your blood boil, it should. And that's the tragedy here, because instead of walking down the aisle surrounded by unconditional love, Lydia walked into a courtroom of family politics. Every smile had a layer of suspicion. Every word of congratulations came with an unspoken but. Every hug carried the tension of unresolved betrayal. And the cameras didn't need to exaggerate a thing. The atmosphere was heavy enough to choke on. So let's call it what it was. This wasn't a wedding. This was a showdown. It was Kim's attempt to reassert dominance. It was Ethan's chance to unleash years of pent-up rage. It was Micah and Mariah's reminder that escape is never really escape when your family insists on dragging you back into the fire. And for Lydia, it was the cruel realization that no matter how much you pray, no matter how much you submit, no matter how much you try to keep the peace, control will always find you on the day you least expect it. And here's the kicker. All of this unfolded on the very day that was supposed to represent freedom. Marriage, biblically speaking, is about leaving and cleaving, leaving your parents and cleaving to your spouse. But the Plath wedding flipped that completely. Instead of leaving, Lydia was being pulled back in. Instead of cleaving to her husband, she was being chained to her mother's conditions. That's not just sad, that's spiritual blackmail. And that, my friends, is why this moment wasn't just TV drama. It was betrayal, spectacle, and faith turned into a weapon. The trifecta of what makes Plathville both addictive and heartbreaking to watch. So buckle in, because in this series we're breaking down exactly how this wedding turned into a war zone. From the pre-wedding ultimatums, to Ethan's explosive meltdown at the reception, to Lydia's eerily calm Instagram posts afterward. It's all connected, and it's all part of the larger pattern of control that has defined this family for years. Stay with me, because what comes next will make you question whether Lydia's silence is really strength, or if it's just another form of captivity dressed up as faith. Before the flowers were placed, before Lydia ever stepped into her white dress, before the vows were whispered, there was a warning. And not just any warning. A mother's ultimatum. Kim Plath, with her signature smile that never quite hides the steel underneath, pulled her daughter aside in the days leading up to the wedding. What should have been a time filled with encouragement and maternal blessing turned into something darker. Kim wasn't there to lift Lydia up. She wasn't there to say, "You've chosen well, my daughter. I'm proud of you." No, Kim was there to remind Lydia of the chains that still bound her. The ultimatum was chilling in its simplicity. Choose carefully, because your loyalty to me, to this family, to this version of faith, must not waver. In other words, even as you step into marriage, even as you build a new life with Zach, you still belong to me. Let that sink in. On the eve of the most important day of Lydia's life, her mother handed her a burden instead of a blessing. And it wasn't subtle. Kim wrapped it, as she always does, in the language of righteousness. She framed her warning as guidance, as holy accountability. She positioned herself not just as Lydia's mother but as her spiritual authority, the one whose approval or disapproval could determine whether Lydia was in God's will. Now here's where the story deepens, because Kim wasn't the only one applying pressure. Ethan, already carrying his own mountain of rage and hurt, became part of the pre-wedding storm. Ethan's relationship with Olivia has been a battlefield for years, and his bitterness toward both his parents and his siblings has festered on-screen season after season. So when the wedding approached, he carried with him an emotional arsenal, ready to explode. Instead of arriving as a protective older brother, Ethan arrived like a judge, holding on to every wound from the past, waiting for a chance to remind everyone of the fractures that have never healed. Lydia, caught in the crossfire, became a pawn in that family war. On one side was Kim with her veiled threats, on the other was Ethan with his resentment. Together, they set the stage for what was never going to be a peaceful union. But here's what longtime viewers of Welcome to Plathville already recognized. This wasn't new. This was the Plath cycle repeating itself. Think back to earlier seasons. Remember when Micah tried to model only to be shamed for stepping outside the family's bubble? Remember when Mariah dared to embrace music and self-expression, and Kim framed it as rebellion instead of growth? Remember when Ethan first married Olivia, and Kim and Barry staged a tug-of-war for his soul, disguising their disapproval as concern? Every time a Plath child tried to carve their own path, Kim swooped in with the same pattern: reframe independence as betrayal, reframe self-expression as sin, reframe loyalty to her as loyalty to God. It's spiritual manipulation, dressed up in smiles and Bible verses. So when Lydia's turn came, no one should have been surprised. The ultimatum wasn't a one-time act, it was the continuation of a decades-long system of control. But the stakes felt higher this time, because Lydia wasn't just choosing a hobby, a career, or a place to live. She was choosing a husband, she was building her own family. And for Kim, that was the ultimate threat. Think about it. Marriage, by definition, creates distance between a child and their parents. The Bible verse is clear: leave and cleave. But for Kim, leaving isn't an option. Control only works if loyalty remains absolute. So her ultimatum was a way of planting a seed in Lydia's mind. Don't think marriage frees you from me. You're still mine, and there will be consequences if you forget it. And that's where Ethan's involvement becomes even more tragic. Because instead of easing the pressure, Instead of defending his sister's right to peace, he unknowingly reinforced the atmosphere of division. His presence, tense, suspicious, ready to ignite, served as a reminder that no one in this family gets married without blood being spilled, metaphorically or otherwise. So why does this matter? Why linger on Kim's ultimatum before moving into the reception chaos? Because ultimatums are never just words. They're time bombs. They sit in the back of the mind, waiting for the moment when stress and emotion turn them into detonations. Lydia heard her mother's warning. She internalized it, tucked it behind her carefully composed smile, and walked into her wedding day already carrying invisible chains. That's why the reception was doomed before it even began. That's why Ethan's rage wasn't a sudden outburst, but the inevitable conclusion of pressure that had been building for years. That's why Lydia's silence, her calmness afterward, felt less like peace, and more like survival. Kim's ultimatum foreshadowed everything. It was the shadow over Lydia's vows. It was the crack in the foundation of what should have been a celebration. It told us, the audience, that this wasn't just about one wedding. It was about whether the Plath cycle of control would ever end. And that's the suspense we carry into the next act. Because once you realize the warning had been delivered, once you recognize the family fractures were already bleeding, you can see the reception not as a random explosion, but as the natural climax of a story that was written long before Lydia said "I do." So the question becomes, did Lydia ever really stand a chance? Or was her wedding destined to collapse under the weight of her family's history from the moment her mother uttered that ultimatum? Receptions are supposed to be the release. The tension of the ceremony is over, the vows are spoken, the tears are shed, now comes the dancing, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the joy that sends everyone home smiling. But not at Lydia's wedding, because what should have been a celebration turned into the Plath family's most public unraveling yet. And it all started with one object, a simple table nameplate. The cameras captured it. Ethan, visibly tense, shoulders squared, jaw clenched, his presence like a storm cloud in the middle of a sunny reception. You could almost feel the air shift as he picked up that nameplate, stared at it, and then, with the weight of years behind him, hurled it across the room. The sound of it hitting the floor wasn't just glass shattering or wood clattering. No, it was louder than that. It was the sound of years of resentment breaking open. It was the noise of a brother who had been silenced, dismissed, and twisted in his loyalties finally erupting, on the very day his sister should have been wrapped in joy. Guests froze. Conversations stuttered. The laughter drained from the room. The reception, once awkwardly festive, became a stage for the deepest, ugliest fractures in the Plath family. And here's what the cameras revealed. This wasn't just Ethan losing control. This was division, carved into the Plath family like a scar, laid bare for the entire world to witness. Look at Barry. He sat stiffly watching his son come undone, but his face gave it away. This was a man who has spent years minimizing conflict, years portraying himself as the quiet, steady patriarch, suddenly confronted with chaos he could no longer deny. Barry didn't stop it, didn't de-escalate. He just absorbed it, silently, as though decades of suppressed dysfunction were finally too heavy to contain. Then there was Micah. His body language said everything. He leaned forward, eyes darting, muscles taut. He's been through this before. He's seen the patterns, lived the control, watched the explosions, and in that moment, he looked less like a supportive brother at a wedding reception, and more like a soldier on alert, bracing for what would come next. Mariah, too, couldn't hide her discomfort. She's been one of the most vocal about the scars Kim and Barry left on their children, and now she was watching those scars rip open again, right in front of the guests, right in front of the cameras, right in front of Lydia, whose only crime that day was trying to get married in peace. And what about Lydia? That's the part that still haunts me, because if you look closely at her, if you slow the footage down, you see it, the flicker in her eyes, the tightening of her smile, the way she carried herself like someone balancing on the edge of a cliff. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even confront Ethan in that moment. Instead, she did what she's always done. She swallowed it, covered it, and tried to move forward as though nothing happened. But viewers weren't fooled. We saw it. We felt it. We knew we weren't watching a wedding anymore. We were watching a battlefield disguised as a reception. And here's my personal commentary. It was gut-wrenching. To sit there as a viewer and watch a sacred day unravel like that, it hits you in the chest. because weddings are supposed to be untouchable. They're supposed to be the one place where family puts down their weapons, even just for a few hours, to honor love. But the Plaths couldn't do it. They couldn't keep their wounds hidden. They couldn't keep their resentments buried. They couldn't even pretend. Ethan's nameplate throw wasn't random, it was symbolic. It was a message, both to his family and to the cameras. This is who we are. This is what's really happening behind the hymns and the prayers. It was a breaking point, and it dragged every guest, every sibling, and every viewer into the reality the Plaths have tried to spin for years. And in that moment, it became undeniable. Years of buried tension had erupted, and no amount of staged family photos or Instagram Bible verses could cover it up again. Because think about it, how many times have we seen hints of this before? The silent dinners, the side glances, the "we're fine" statements that rang hollow. This wasn't just about Lydia's wedding day. This was the past crashing into the present. This was every argument, every ultimatum, every manipulation, every escape attempt converging into one shocking act at the reception. And that's why it mattered so much. Because it told us, in the clearest way possible, that this family is not healed. They are not united. They are not pretending well enough anymore. What we saw that day was the truth. Raw, ugly, devastating. For Lydia, it was a nightmare. For viewers, it was confirmation. And for the Plaths, it was a public reckoning, broadcast for the world to see. So as the reception stumbled on, as people tried to pick up the pieces and act like nothing had happened, one thing was already certain: the meltdown couldn't be erased. It couldn't be excused as a moment. It was the climax of everything we've been watching for years, and it left a stain on Lydia's wedding that will never fade. When the last song faded, when the guests went home whispering, and when the shattered nameplate was swept from the floor, Lydia Plath had a choice. She could erupt. She could call out her family. She could turn her wedding into a declaration of war, but she didn't. Instead, Lydia did what she's always done. She carried herself with quiet dignity, and days later she broke her silence in the most Plath-like way possible, not through a sit-down tell-all, not through an explosive interview, but through carefully chosen Instagram posts. And that's where we saw her strategy. Instead of lashing out at Ethan, or at Kim, or even at the entire family dynamic, Lydia took a different path. She reframed what happened, the ultimatums, the humiliation, the literal chaos at her own reception, as something she could endure with grace. She spoke about love, forgiveness, and patience, as though those qualities could turn pain into purpose. One post in particular struck everyone. She referred to what she was doing as missionary work, not in the traditional sense of traveling across the globe, but in the way she seemed to suggest that staying in this toxic family dynamic was itself a kind of mission, a calling to serve, to endure, to bear witness. That phrase, missionary work, stopped me in my tracks, because what Lydia was really telling us is that she sees her suffering as something holy. She is reframing her survival as a spiritual calling, and as painful as it is to hear, it also explains so much about why she didn't fight back with rage. It was her way of reclaiming control. By calling it missionary work, she took what could have been interpreted as passivity and turned it into purpose. Instead of appearing trapped, she appeared chosen, someone strong enough to shoulder the weight others couldn't. But here's where the contrast becomes unavoidable. Lydia's path looks nothing like her siblings before her. Think of Olivia. She's been vocal about her rejection of Kim and Barry's control, breaking away not just physically but ideologically. Olivia has called out manipulation, set boundaries, and walked away from family events when they crossed her lines. Her rebellion has been open, fiery, and unapologetic. Mariah too chose fire, though in a different way. Her rebellion was artistic, emotional, embodied in her fashion, her music, her refusal to conform. She turned pain into art, letting the world see her raw edges rather than hiding them. Micah, meanwhile, carved his own independence by walking away, pursuing modeling, and crafting a lifestyle that Kim and Barry never imagined for him. His rebellion has been quieter than Mariah's but firm, a physical departure, a choice to exist outside the bubble entirely. But Lydia, she hasn't left. She hasn't cut ties. She hasn't even openly criticized her parents. Instead, she stays and redefines that choice as strength. Where her siblings saw escape as survival, Lydia paints endurance as her mission. And that's what makes her so different, and honestly so compelling to watch. because her response after the wedding wasn't just silence, it was strategy. She let Ethan's rage and Kim's manipulation play out on camera. She let the world see the dysfunction, and then instead of matching their fire with fire, she came back with something softer, something disarming, something almost impossible to attack. Grace, I'll be honest, it's complicated to watch. On one hand, you want to shake her and say, Lydia, you don't have to martyr yourself for this family. You don't have to call abuse missionary work. You deserve joy without strings attached. On the other hand, you can't help but admire her strength. She's choosing a form of resistance that doesn't look like rebellion, but it's resistance nonetheless. Because here's the emotional contrast the show handed us. The reception was rage, noise, humiliation. It was Ethan's voice raised, nameplates flying, family members tense and ashamed. But Lydia's aftermath was quiet, calm, deliberate. She didn't return humiliation with humiliation. She returned it with composure, and that contrast hit harder than any outburst could have. It reminded viewers that sometimes strength isn't in yelling the loudest, it's in refusing to be pulled down to the same level. Her missionary work statement may frustrate some, but it's also her armor. It allows her to endure without breaking. It lets her see herself as more than a victim. And in a family where control is currency, Lydia found a way to stay inside the system without appearing crushed by it. It doesn't mean the pain isn't real. You could see it in her wedding day smile, in the way her eyes darted after Ethan's outburst, in the way her body seemed to shrink under the weight of her family's chaos. The pain is there, the humiliation is there, but her choice to reframe it, to call it missionary work, to transform silence into strength, is her way of surviving. And maybe, just maybe, it's her quietest rebellion of all. When we step back from the chaos of Lydia and Zach's wedding, we see something bigger than one family fight. What played out on camera wasn't just personal, it was systemic. It was the perfect example of how reality television doesn't just document dysfunction, it thrives on it. Think about it. Weddings are supposed to be sacred, intimate and protected. But on Welcome to Plathville, a wedding becomes a stage. Every raised voice, every broken nameplate, every whispered family division, all of it is content, and producers know exactly what they're doing. They frame the shots, they linger on the tears, they edit for maximum impact, because in the world of reality TV, dysfunction isn't failure, it's ratings gold. And who benefits most from that? Kim Plath. For years Kim has maintained power, not just through her role as mother, but through her ability to turn her children's milestones into spectacle. Birthdays, weddings, graduations, they all become opportunities for her to reassert control, to remind her kids and the audience that nothing happens without her presence looming in the background. By keeping the family's drama front and center, Kim ensures that she remains relevant, both in the family hierarchy and in the show's narrative. That's what made Lydia's wedding such a flashpoint. This wasn't just about Ethan throwing a nameplate or Kim whispering ultimatums. This was about control. Who gets to define the meaning of Lydia's most important day? And by the time the credits rolled, it was clear that control was still the currency of this family. But here's the cost. Lydia and Zach, what should have been the beginning of their marriage, was tainted by spectacle. Instead of memories filled with laughter and warmth, they walked away with memories of tension, manipulation, and public humiliation. And while Lydia may call it missionary work as a way to cope, the reality is that the cameras don't turn off when the vows are over. The fallout will bleed into the next season, shaping storylines and fueling more family conflict. And that's the cycle. The show thrives because the family is divided. Every outburst becomes a teaser. Every wound becomes an episode. And the question hanging over Lydia and Zach now is whether their love can withstand not just family pressure, but the relentless grind of reality television. So here's where I want to bring you in. Which moment shocked you the most? Was it Kim's ultimatum before the wedding, Ethan's explosive meltdown at the reception, or Lydia's almost eerie calm afterward, reframing it all as strength? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to hear how you process this roller coaster. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, so you don't miss the next deep dive into the chaos, control, and heartbreak at the center of Welcome to Plathville. Because in the end, this wedding wasn't just a family milestone, it was a battlefield. And once again the cameras were rolling,